Okay. Good evening, dear friends. Everything should be okay now. Welcome to this book discussion. We are almost 10 minutes late, so we are going to continue the broadcast until 10 past 9. I have in tribute to those who taught me English and those who taught. Nobody can claim to be completely self-made. I start by giving tribute to those who taught me English in primary school, like Mrs. Bukenya in Magwa Primary School, Nelson Isiko. Of course, from my lower primary school, Genaro. And then in secondary school, Miss Malamba, later Mrs. Ruth Etori, Amatre, who we nicknamed Obatala after one of the characters in the Nigerian novels. And of course, Robert Chaligonza, comrade. By popular vote, people on Twitter decided that we should discuss Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. Things Fall Apart is one of the greatest novels worldwide. Everybody wonders why Chinua Achebe was not the first to get a Nobel Prize in Literature. I'm going to hold this discussion and I hope you can participate in an interactive way. Give your comments, to which I'll try my best to respond to. First and foremost, we'll talk about the plot of the novel. We don't have a lot of time. This is a book which is taught normally for months. We'll talk about the plot, which means what happens, what are the storylines. We'll talk about some of the characters. Then we'll talk about the theme. We'll try to interpret the book. We'll talk about the setting of the book. Everybody has heard of Okongo, of course. So characterization is very important. While promoting this book talk, I told you that the reason why this book made it to my short list and the reason why I put it in the Twitter poll is because it says a lot about leadership. Every leader is expected to have what is known as a moral code, a compass. You can call it the true north of leadership. How flexible or inflexible that moral code can determine whether that leader will succeed or not. So let's look at the setting of the novel. The novel is set in Umofia, a community of the Igbo tribe in eastern Nigeria. That's the community of Chinua Achebe. If you have heard of Ojuku, if you have heard of Biafra, that is the setting. The time of the novel is just about when Christian missionaries and the colonialists were arriving in Nigeria. And the central plot of the book is about a man called Okonkwo. Okonkwo's father was known as Onoka. And the way Chinua Achebe describes Onoka makes you to find him as a man who is nobody's role model. And yet he was Okonkwo's father. I'll tell you a few things that I remember from reading the book. Onoka loved eating and drinking. One of the favorite passages I remember is when he's quoted to have said, "When I look at the mouth of a dead man, then I think of the folly of not eating when one is still alive." He was always happy when drinking palm wine, and Achebe describes him that his face exuded peace when he was eating or drinking. Onoka was heavily indebted, but he was so uncaring about his debts. He never took his responsibility to pay his debts seriously. In one of the passages in the novel, Onoka is visited by one of his creditors very early in the morning. Of course, Onoka had chalked on his wall, he had written on his wall how much he owed each of his debtors. How much he owed each of his creditors. On this morning, one of his creditors came in, knocked the door, and Onoka opened. He stated his business. Instead of humbly telling the creditor that he doesn't have the money to pay immediately, instead, Onoka blasts the creditor. He points to the wall where he has marked how much he owes each of his creditors. And he tells this man, "Look at this man who I owe a lot more money than you. And he has not come as early as you to wake me up from my sleep, to disturb me demanding. Why have you come this early to demand such little money?" That's the kind of father Okonkwo had. Okonkwo made a resolution to become a great wrestler, a great warrior, and a great farmer. He wanted to be as different as possible from his father, Onoka. At a young age, he became a great wrestler. You all remember that scene where he's said to have wrestled down the greatest wrestler in Umofia, who was known as Amalinze the Cat. He was called the Cat because his back never touched the ground. Chinua Achebe, in fact, says Okonkwo's fame spread like a fire in the Hamatan. That's how much of a reputation this man had. He then became a great farmer growing yams. He was wealthy enough to take care of a large family of 3 wives and 8 children, the eldest of whom was called Noye. Noye was put under a lot of pressure by Okonkwo because Okonkwo wanted Noye to be like him, and yet Noye appeared not to be so interested in being like his father. Okonkwo, therefore, on the basis of detesting his father's ineptness, chose to be an overachiever. And indeed, he became an overachiever. He became an opinion leader. He was also a great warrior. In one of the wars that they fought against another tribe, they were able to capture people, and they gave terms of surrender to the defeated tribe. one of the terms required them to surrender a young man called Ikemefuna. Ikemefuna was a little boy, and the tribe in Umofia entrusted Okonko to take care of Ikemefuna. And Ikemefuna grew up just like one of Okonko's children. He was a good boy. One night, Okonko was visited by elders of the village, and they were whispering. Apparently, the spirits or the whatever gods they worshipped had instructed them to kill Ikemefuna. Okonko had some good friends, one of whom was known as Obierika. Achebe describes Obierika as a man who thought about things. He was a reflective man. And they felt that even though Okonko would be part of the group that would take the young boy on the village path and kill him, nevertheless they told Okonko not to take part in the actual killing. And they argued with him, and they told him, Okonko, this boy calls you father. You can't kill him. But Okonko's character was such that he didn't want to show any sign of weakness. And he felt that if he didn't participate in killing this boy, they would think him weak. So in the morning, at the crack of dawn, they woke up the little boy, Ikemefuna, and the men who were assigned for the task of killing him started moving along the village path. They put a pot on his head to carry, and he didn't know where they were going, but he felt relieved, according to Achebe, that at least a man he called his father, Okonko, was there. So he knew nothing bad would happen. Suddenly one of the men turned around to strike Ikemefuna with a cutlass or a machete for that matter. But he missed. Naturally, Ikemefuna ran towards his father, Okonko. Father, father, he shouted. According to the advice given to him, Okonko shouldn't have drawn his machete to cut this boy. But he felt that he would be considered weak if he doesn't. So, instinctively, he just drew his machete and cut this boy and killed him. That really, really haunted him. He felt very bad that he had killed the boy. But on impulse, as a man who fears to be thought weak, he felt he had done the right thing. Okonko was so rigid in character that many times he took decisions that were not well considered. They were impulsive. Around that time, the white men started making their encroachment into the village. And Okonko was one of those who was considered to be an elder. He attended meetings of the elders' council to show that he was a man who was well regarded. He's one of those whose speeches were well listened to. He even participated as one of those who would dance as the masked representatives of the spirits. In the novel, they are called a gugu. But Okonko used to walk with a unique gait. In fact, they said that his heels would hardly touch the ground. So he was easy to detect. In the novel, Okonko's other side is the iron hand with which he ruled his family. He was ruthless in enforcing discipline. In one instance, which is very well described in the novel, Okonko beat up his wife so badly to near death, and he was temporarily exiled. He did it during the month when people are not supposed to quarrel, people are not supposed to be violent. So he violated an important community code. As a result, he was exiled for some time in punishment, and then he came back. Now we go to Okonko's inability to adapt. You all know that adaptability is a very important trait when you are dealing with new phenomenon. When you are dealing with a new phenomenon, you have got to observe that new phenomenon, understand its true characteristics, and then orient yourself to it, and then you decide how you are going to deal with it, and then take action. You cannot do it in reverse. You cannot first take action, then you start considering what you have done in relation to the new phenomenon. You have all heard the story of why we no longer have dinosaurs. Dinosaurs were huge creatures, muscular, strong teeth, very fast. It's said that some could even fly, but they were not adaptable. If you read Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, he said that the species that survive are not the strongest, but the ones that are the most adaptable. Now, in understanding Okonko's worldview, you need to understand that for him, he felt that the Igbo way of life, as seen in Omofia, is the right way, and there is no other way of life that is acceptable. That was his inflexible worldview. So anything else had no room for him. And that dictated how he responded to colonialism, for instance. I'll tell you, towards the end of the book, there is a passage which I will read for you, just so that you know the challenge that Okonko faced. They had a meeting which was unfortunately interrupted. So, this is what happens to Okonko. The tribal leaders convened a meeting very late at night, and things fall apart actually needs to be understood backwards. The best way to understand it is to understand it backwards. It is the briefest scene, but also the most dramatic. It is dramatic because Okonko is seen as a leader. But there comes a time sometimes when followers can abandon a leader. And sometimes a leader is so far away from his followers that he does not understand what is going on. So during that late night meeting, the leaders are discussing the efforts by the British colonialists to subjugate, oppress, and to humiliate the village. Unknown to the gathered elders, messengers from the colonial powers walked into the meeting where the elders were. According to Chinua Achebe, Okonko jumps up and is trembling. His face is full of hatred. He is detesting these people who have come as messengers of the colonialists. As you know, Okonkwo was very well built. He was an intimidating man. According to Chinua Achebe, Okonkwo is tall and huge, and his bushy eyebrows and wide nose gave him a very severe look. But the messenger of the colonialists stand firm. Let me quote what Chinua Achebe says. In that brief moment, the world seemed to stand still, waiting. There was utter silence. The men of Omofia were merged into the mute backcloth of trees and giant creepers, waiting. The spell was broken by the head messenger. "Let me pass," he ordered. "What do you want here?" "The white man whose power you know too well has ordered this meeting to stop." In a flash, Okonkwo drew his machete. The messenger crouched to avoid the blow. It was useless. Okonkwo's machete descended twice, and the man's head lay beside his uniformed body. There were more than one messenger, and Okonkwo expected that other members of his tribe would rise up and attack the other messengers. But he does nothing. They do nothing to join Okonkwo in attacking these messengers. At that moment, Okonkwo realizes that he's alone in that struggle. What does Okonkwo do? Without a word to his fellow elders, he just walks to his compound and does something which is completely abominable according to the tribal code. He hangs himself. The Igbo people consider suicide to be an abomination. They believe that it makes your body evil and untouchable. In fact, they believe that suicide desecrates the entire community, and some rituals have got to be performed, sacrifices have got to be made to cleanse the community. Of course, the most powerful person on the side of the colonialists was the district commissioner. He's the highest ranking officer. He comes to Okonkwo's compound. Who does he meet? Obierika, the philosophical man I talked about earlier. And Obierika looks at this district commissioner. This is what he says. He was choking. He had tears. He was sad. Obierika says, "That man was one of the greatest men in Omofia. You drove him to kill himself, and he now will be buried like a dog." Let us try to interpret how Okonkwo reaches this point. What went wrong? Why did he fail to understand how his fellow elders would react? Would they follow him and draw their machetes and kill the other messengers of the colonial power? Or would they cow down? Above all, why did he choose to violate a fundamental ethical principle of his community by hanging himself? There are many people who have analyzed what makes who Okonkwo is and why he does things the way he does them. And by the way, this book is not just taught as literature. It is also taught as a case study of leadership. There are some questions that we need to ask to understand Okonko. The first one is about human emotion and how they influence a leader's worldview and a leader's moral code. There are some people who draw strength from their parents. Okonko is not one of those. His father was inept, heavily indebted, weak, and generally nobody's role model. Okonko defied that background. Then there are those who draw strength from their fathers. Even in Uganda, you know, there are people who loved their parents. Some world leaders had great leaders. You may talk about Senator McCain, his father was also there. Talk about Al Gore, the father was there. The Kennedys have that tradition. You can talk about Uhuru Kenyatta. Those are the people who draw strength from their father's background. Sometimes your father's legacy encourages you. Sometimes your father's legacy is a challenge. Now, that is one thing which was very emotional. Okonko's father was kind, but he was a playful man who was not very serious about anything. Okonko believed that grit or hard work was the way to go. And that's why he made a resolution never to be like his father. Along the way, he's respected, he's also feared. So, if you have principles that you must stand by as a person, there should be some emotional roots to it. Now you can understand Okonko better. Another thing which we have to consider is that all human beings have failures. I've already told you that Okonko had some weaknesses. One of them was his very hot temper. I told you how he beat up his wife during the sacred month or the sacred season, and he had to be exiled. But the other weakness of Okonko is fear. So his hot temper, his fear of showing any weakness is actually rooted in his fear. Unfortunately, for Okonko, his world started changing. If the colonialists hadn't come, if Omofia had remained a stable and peaceful community where you have the seasons of preparing fields, you have seasons of harvest, and the singing and dancing, I don't think Okonko would have ended up tragically as he did. So, Okonko's inflexible principles would have served him well if there was no interruption. Now, on top of his hot temper, which I described, beating up his wife to near death, and you know the crime the wife committed? She didn't feed the children. Okonko could simply not give a punishment which is proportional to that. So Okonko is punished, but he does not learn much from it. How should Okonko have reacted to this failure, his great failure? He was proud, he was bad-tempered, and all this temper and pride was simply because of fear. Sometimes we admire certain people. In fact, Okonko is admired because he was a domineering figure. He was the kind of person you would say, he's a strong man. But behind that strength lay lots of weaknesses also. Let us now examine what we all face in life as we try to interpret this book. Life has corners, and around the corners you meet surprises. And the test to every person is, how do you handle these surprises? Okonko was tough. He was determined. He had characteristics that everybody would admire. But as a human being, you must not let those characteristics dominate you to the extent that you can't control them. Let's say you're a giant and you can beat up anybody. If that becomes your major defining feature, then you end up as a bully. Chinua Achebe presents Okonko in a manner that establishes a pattern, and that pattern runs all through the book. I've told you another weakness that comes out of the fear. That is the story of Ekemefona, who was a tribute really. He was handed over as part of a peace treaty. Listen to what one of the elders tells Okonko. After they came and announced that one of their spirits, called the Oracle of the Cave, had decreed that Ekemefuna must die, one elder says, "I want you to have nothing to do with it. That boy calls you father." Unfortunately, Okonko wants to prove that he's not a coward. This is what happens. They are moving in line. Ekemefuna is also moving in front of Okonko. And that makes Ekemefuna comfortable. Then someone clears his throat. And Ekemefuna is now worried because Okonko has now gone back to the end of the line, according to the novel. Then the man who was now behind Ekemefuna, who had replaced Okonko, draws his machete and strikes, but misses. At that point, Okonko runs towards Ekemefuna to just finish the job. So, his dominant characteristic is fear. Let us also look at Okonko's biggest challenge. In life, we must know what our obligations are. Obligations means knowing the difference between what is right and wrong, as opposed to what is merely convenient. Sometimes we all have what we call ethical lines. In the case of Ekemefuna, Okonko's ethical line was to have nothing to do with the killing of Ekemefuna. Now, that's the reason why he drew to the back of the line. Unfortunately, when the man who was supposed to kill Ekemefuna with one strike of his machete misses, Okonko now feels that it is his duty. The killing of Ekemefuna is different from the wars that Okonko participated in. If Okonko was in battle, it would have been different. At that time, he would have been called a courageous man who is killing an enemy who is armed, who also wants to kill him. In this case, Ekemefuna is an unarmed, innocent boy. Therefore, we would say in that case, Okonko was deficient. Let us study and reflect on Okonko's motives. Many times when you look at a person doing something, you've got to ask the question, why? Indeed, in one of the most moving scenes, and I believe that's what drove Okonko to kill himself, when he drew his machete and killed one of the messengers of the colonial powers, he probably expected cheers from his fellow elders. Instead, nobody made a move. Nobody followed his example. His best friend, who was always at hand to give him good advice, instead looked at him and asked him, "Why did you do it?" And Okonko, in his heart, must have said, "Even you, Obierika, you're asking me, you, the person that I expect to understand why I'm doing this, to uphold the dignity of my community and save it from humiliation. You can't understand why I've killed this messenger of the imperialists." Once again, his anger overpowered him, just when he went and hanged himself, committing another abomination. Solid human beings must have a motive which has some moral content. The leaders and individuals along the ilk of Okonko who act impulsively are considered to be men of straw. In other words, the reason why they do things is devoid of any morality. But it's wrong to expect people at all times to transcend their humanity. Okonko was a human being. He was not an angel, so you would not expect that his motives would be pure. But Okonko had that deep-seated fear. He put himself at the center of most of the things that he did as an individual. Okonko never feared anybody, but he was always afraid of what others may think. So his motive was always wrapped around the question, what will people say? The lesson from this book is that as a human being, you must have your own moral code based on what you consider right. And the motive for your actions, decisions, should not be based on what you think others may think about you, but rather what yourself believe to be right. That was Okonko's fundamental weakness. But at a deeper level, any show of kindness and any show of weakness was a stark reminder of his father, who he never admired at all. Now, let me make this clear. There's nothing wrong with fear. Everybody has some fears. We all fear for our personal safety sometimes. We fear for our well-being. We fear anything which threatens our loved ones. That is normal. But Okonko's greatest failure was that his motive for his actions, the killing of Ikemefuna, beating up his wife to near death, and finally killing the colonialist messenger, was because he had that fear. What will people say? As we come to a close of this book talk, let's consider the things that determine the choices that we make. To me, this is probably one of the saddest things that we can think about as we discuss. Now, it is not that Okonko is not conscious when he makes the wrong decision. Listen to what Chinua Achebe says after the killing of Ikemefuna. Okonko returns home. He eats nothing for days and nights on end. He's only drinking palm wine. His eyes were red and fierce like the eyes of a rat when it was caught by the tail and dashed against the floor. And Chinua Achebe describes what has happened inside Okonko, and he says, this even had an impact on his son, Noye. And he says that something inside Noye must have given way. In the words of Chinua Achebe, he says, given way like the snapping of a tightened bow. Okonko knows that he has done something terribly wrong. So, at a moment that he needed to take a decision which is in line with his obligation to his family, to his tribe, and even to Ikemefuna, he fails dismally. By the way, by this time Okonko was not a young man. He was already in his 40s. He was admired as a young man. He was devoted to his tribe. He lived by its values and norms, and he had no room for any other world. So, as we talk about his motive, we ask perhaps one of the most important questions we all face. Remember, I told you about adaptability. Adaptability means you keep learning. So we ask the question, was it possible for Okonko to learn and change? Was his worldview or his moral code adaptable and flexible enough? In other words, could he grow? Colonialism was not a personal challenge to Okonko. It was a challenge for the entire community. In other words, was he in charge of his moral code to the extent that he could adapt it to changing environments? This leads us to another question. I already told you that Okonkwo had fear. Now, overcoming fear of what others think or what others could think requires you to have the courage to embrace a second opinion. In other words, are you strong enough to reconsider a strongly held position? As a politician, this is a question I have to ask myself regularly. We see all around us, we admire people who take a position and they just say, rain or shine, this is my position. But many times we have to reconsider. By the way, even God reconsiders. Remember, he burnt down Sodom and Gomorrah. He drowned the entire world in the days of Noah. But he reconsidered and sent Jesus Christ. Human beings need to have the courage to reconsider. Leaders who don't reconsider are very dangerous. Because if you are on a collision course, as Okonkwo was indeed on a collision course, sometimes you have to look at the bigger picture, and that will give you the courage to reconsider. Okonkwo is said to have changed a bit after killing Ikemefuna. He became more loving, he became more compassionate to his family. You could even say he showed signs of tenderness, characteristics that he had never had at all. According to Chinua Achebe, after the killing of Ikemefuna, Okonkwo's daughter falls very sick. Okonkwo cares for her. Remember, that was supposed to be the duty of his wife. But Okonkwo prepares the medicine for the daughter, tends to her, and until she recovers. Okonkwo shows that he also has some positive emotions. There was a time that one of the gods, known as the oracle of the cave, takes away one of his children, and the mother and other people follow. Instead of being indifferent as expected, Okonkwo decides also to walk and follow them. Okonkwo's wife is surprised that Okonkwo actually cared enough to follow them. Achebe says her eyes were filled with tears when she saw Okonkwo, because she could not believe that this man who she considered to be very hard-hearted had actually appeared there. So they stayed together outside the cave until the oracle freed the daughter, and then they went home together. So Okonkwo's views of the world starts broadening. He begins to realize that, something has got to give. You also have to give room for other things. Unfortunately, the world in Omofia is changing too fast for these new emotions to ferment and take hold. It is important that in reading this book, all of us realize that character is central. Things Fall Apart is a story. Things Fall Apart is centered around the choices that one important actor in the character of Okonkwo faces. By the way, Okonkwo did not lack opportunities to reflect and change. I told you earlier that Okonkwo was banished for 7 years. In his banishment, he had the opportunity to reflect. He had to reflect about his relationship with his father and that memory, what he did in participating in the killing of Ikemefuna, his achievements as a young man in war and in wrestling. But instead of taking the 7 years to reflect and pick up the lessons, in the entire 7 years, Okonkwo is only thinking of when his banishment will end so that he goes back to Omofia. So during the day, he's farming. At night, he's drowned in self-pity. He's not reflecting. Nobody can advise him. To make it worse, as if his sorrows were unending, his firstborn son, Noye, converts to Christianity. Because around that time is when the first missionaries arrived, and his son decides to convert. So, Okonkwo's world is upside down. If you saw the book cover that I posted earlier, the cover of the book shows a man with the head turned upside down. Instead of reflecting on the motives that may have driven Noye to convert to Christianity, instead of accepting that his son has adopted and chosen a new path, instead Okonkwo becomes even more and more inflexible. He doesn't reflect on the need to look at the new things that are happening. So, you could say Omofia itself is like a village. But it is a village which is like a character in the story. Let's look at some of the hard questions that we must ask. We have talked about Unoka, Okonkwo's father. We have talked about Okonkwo. Now we are talking about Noye. Those are 3 generations. For Noye, he's not like his father Okonkwo. He is capable of asking questions like, why do the people of Omofia behave in a certain way? Is it possible for the way of life of Christians to coexist with the way of life of the people of Omofia? He starts questioning some of the things that the Omofia people do. For those who have read the novel, and for those who haven't read it, and I hope this discussion has stimulated your interest, you know what to do as we build this book club. You'll send me your email address, and I'll send you a PDF copy of the book so that you can read it and make your own interpretations. Noye, who is now a Christian, starts asking some very, very tough questions. Why do the Omofia people when they have twins, abandon them in the evil forest to die? Why did that oracle decree that Ikemefuna must die? Must the villagers of Umofia keep on obeying that so-called oracle of the cave? In that way, Noe has chosen a different path from his father. He's beginning to question his community's practices and beliefs. So, Noe shows signs of growing. In other words, Noe is not repudiating the moral code of his community, but rather he's embracing a new way of expressing. You can actually hold on to your moral code, hold on to your convictions, but you can express it in a different way. Another character who is not so dominant in the novel is Uchendu. Uchendu is Okonko's uncle. He is modest and open. He's not like Okonko. So one time, when they are talking about a market, a village market that the white people attacked, Okonko simply says, what's wrong with those villagers who were at the market? They should have been armed and they should have fought back. And his friend, Obierika, says that the white person may attack, but somehow nobody believes that it is true that they attacked. Listen to what Okonko's uncle says. Here is Uchendu. There is no story that is not true. The world has no end, and what is good among one people is an abomination with others. Now, that is wisdom. Some of you may say that is relativism. But in a way, Okonko's uncle understands the threats to the way of life of his people. And he cares about the way of life of his people. But Uchendu is simply telling Okonko, why don't you step back a bit from discussing war and the tactics of defeating the colonial powers, and instead try to understand what is happening. Pick up lessons that you have learned. Chinua Achebe is telling us that Okonko failed to understand that the traditional beliefs, worldview, and way of life of the Umofia people on their own could no longer guide people like Okonko. We have only a few minutes left. Let me sum up. Chinua Achebe is teaching all of us how to confront those surprises that I talked about earlier. The things in life that you meet around the bend, around the corner. Sort of like when you're driving and you meet a sudden pothole. Sometimes you can meet with an accident around the bend. You don't know that there's probably a lorry that got stuck there and you crash. How do we face the tough realities that keep surprising us around the corners that are so many on the path of life? Believe me, none of these people has a ready answer. We must accept sometimes that actually nobody has a ready answer. Obierika is one of my best characters in that novel because he shows intellectual honesty. He looks at the reality, uses logic, and follows it wherever it is taking him. Okonko, on the other hand, predetermines how a matter should be concluded. So, what is Okonko's biggest weakness? You could say his rigid private morality. I want to tell you what Obierika tells Okonko. This is the last quote. Listen. Obierika says, "The white man is very clever. He came quietly and peaceably with his religion. We were amused at his foolishness and allowed him to stay. Now he has won our brothers, and our clan can no longer act like one." This is the central fact. He adds, by the way, to me, I find this the saddest passage in the book. Every Pan-Africanist, everybody who wants Africa to cut itself loose from economical bondage should read this book. This is so sad. Obierika says, "The white man has put a knife on the things that held us together, and we have fallen apart." I want to thank you all for being part of this book discussion. Till next time, I'm Norbert. Goodbye.